Budget 2018-19. 1 hour ago,
give me my phone also.
Hello and welcome to the Wire's discussion of the Union Budget 2018-19. 1 hour ago, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley just finished giving his budget speech for the year. And all budgets are political in a sense, but the budget this time around is there's a sense of urgency, partly because state government, there are many assembly elections this year, and of course the general elections are last year, and therefore this will be the last full budget of the Modi government. And the headline numbers, of course, are so the fiscal deficit target has been loosened. It was supposed to be 3.2% for 2017-18. It's now 3.5%, and next year again from 3% it's been shifted to 3.3%. But apart from that, the political messaging, I mean, we'll dive down into the details of funding, but the messaging seems to be agricultural and health. Siddharth, your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it's a political budget, and it's clear that the big numbers and the big picture has been driven by the Modi-Jaitley team's assessment that, contrary to a lot of the bullish talk that they have engaged in over the last year and a half or 2 years, the economy at the base is in need of some reinvigoration. Rural areas in particular, even in the 2 interviews that Modi gave, which were kind of fairly scripted interviews, the issue of rural distress could not be dodged.
Correct.
So this is something that's top of their mind.
Yeah.
And I think health, it's a concern, it's a perennial concern. And survey after survey has shown how a major source of vulnerability for the majority of Indians, and certainly poor Indians, is sickness. You fall ill, chances are that you will become impoverished or further impoverished. So I think that the rural focus is to address the very patent rural distress, which is staring everybody in the face. And I think the health push, which to my mind is actually not much of a push, and I think we need to discuss that a little bit. But the health push is essentially to present to the voting public at large that here is a government that is taking Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas seriously. And so you have eye-catching numbers, eye-popping numbers in some ways. Whether they will translate into things on the ground is the big question mark.
Yeah. So I mean, let's come to agriculture. So I mean, the economic survey put it very clearly earlier this week. So farmer incomes have remained stagnant. They've remained constant over the last 4 years, and even rural wages by large have in the 2%, 3% growth range. So one of the biggest things was when the Modi government came to power, its electoral promise was that it would provide 50% profit margin over production costs. And today, for Kharif crops, they've said that we are going to stick to that principle. But is it a little too late, or should we?
The fact that the Modi, the Prime Minister himself promised it during the campaign. It was there in the BJP's manifesto. And this was a constant source of anger for farmers' organizations over the last 3 years. Our reporters, whenever they went into the field, important agricultural states, Punjab, for example, or during various election campaigns, talking to farmers and rural population, constant complaint was that the BJP hasn't come good on that promise. And it wasn't just a sense that they promised something and didn't give it to us, right? The fact is that the way input costs have risen has rendered farming a loss-making proposition for all but medium to fairly well-to-do peasants and farmers. And so late in the day, the government has veered around to the idea that, well, we have to come good on that. Even now, I dare say there will be some dispute about how seriously the government will follow through with this. Raman Maan, who was an agriculture commentator, he went on Twitter to point out that you have, which input cost the government uses is going to be crucial because you have different estimates of this, and farmers obviously will fear being shortchanged.
Correct.
And then the issue also, comes up: how many farmers actually get MSP in the first place? So I think that the MSP is top of the mind. It's an issue that's very farmers' organizations have been vocal about. But I suspect it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the overall situation of rural distress.
Correct.
So the government has clearly recognized the problem and its responsibility to deal with it.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure whether this measure of saying that we will finally implement 50% profit margin over input costs will can be implemented in time for the
2019 elections.
2019 election.
Correct. I mean, so there's a host of other things. So I mean, I think another recent cause of rural anger and farmer agricultural anger is that the farm loan waivers did not work out as expected. So that was again promised, most recently, of course, in the run-up to the UP elections and whatnot. And you see that it's not really worked out. The people who really needed it have not gotten it, and the people who have gotten it have not gotten enough. And so, I mean, they've increased the agricultural credit target from 10 lakh last year to 11 lakh, and he's launched something called Operation Green.
Yeah.
But a relatively small amount, 500 crores to it, and for a rather vague purpose of just general agricultural infrastructure.
Again, the farm loan waivers, when they were announced by BJP ruled states, Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh was this big announcement that Yogi Adityanath made. People were very happy. Of course, conservative economists took a dim view of this and said, and even the Union Finance Ministry and perhaps even Jaitley himself, I recall, saying that, well, it's up to the UP government to find the money for this because we ain't going to help them pay for it. Well, it now turns out that the way you square the circle is by actually not delivering on the farm waiver, or the farm loan waiver. So we saw these horror stories of indebted farmers getting a check for 1 rupee and this sort of nonsense. And to my mind, in any case, the inability of a farmer to repay a loan that he or she has taken is symptomatic of the mishandling of the rural economy.
Correct.
Not just by this government. I mean, I would say neglect over a long period.
Correct.
One could argue that, a better designed loan waiver scheme is needed so that immediate distress is addressed. But the fact is that you are putting Band-Aid on a gaping wound. And unless the fundamental imbalances in the rural economy are addressed, and, I hope the MSP, the promise is delivered and farming, becomes a more remunerative occupation for people who are in it. But unless that fundamental issue is addressed, farmers will continue to, get indebted. They will continue to have problems repaying. You will make promises as a politician that you will not come through on, and the end result will be the kind of tragedies that we see in different states of farmers committing suicide because they can't service their debt.
Correct. I mean, there was a lot of signaling, at least towards farmers. So, for instance, some parts of the budget were in Hindi and whatnot, but we don't know if it will be enough before.
There's sort of some tax exemptions for the farmers' organizations, produce organizations. I mean, there's some positive steps that people have, one could easily identify in the budget. So, I think the intent is clear. One could, one can be churlish and say this is, politically driven, election driven, whatever the reason. I think it was high time that this government, turned its attention to reviving and boosting the rural sector. So, full marks as far as recognizing that there is a problem. You've done it a little late. You've done it, I think, a little inadequately. But the focus was essential. Even if you've done it for political reasons, if farmers benefit, how can anybody argue? The only question is, will they really end up benefiting?
Correct, that's true. But if you look at the rural economy apart from the agricultural space, so the Rural Development Ministry by itself has only a 5,000 crore increase in its budget. Narega, the work for hire scheme, has gotten 55,000 crores this year, which is essentially the same as the revised estimate of last year. So, I mean, one could argue, of course, that they will infuse another 7,000 to 10,000 crores this year. But in terms of rural infrastructure, not much. I mean, we're not seeing a huge.
Yeah, I mean, I was like you looking at the numbers. So I would say on Narega, as you point out, it's demand driven, and it's not a coincidence that they have allocated exactly what they spent last year. And I would imagine their hope would be that as a result of some of their initiatives, this may lead to less demand on the Narega program as a whole. It's possible that farmers may rely more on hired labor, and I don't know. I mean, this is a question mark. We've seen in the past that governments have been forced to scramble when you realize that the amount of allocation is not enough.
Correct.
And there's been a time lag. Often money that is allocated isn't paid on time, and Narega wage arrears is a big problem for people living on the margins. But let's set Narega aside. a major part of the unprofitable nature of farming and the rural sector as a whole is the poor state of infrastructure, right? And that's where things like the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana scheme or the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, the earlier so-called Indira Gandhi Awas Yojana, these were meant to fill an important gap. Sadly, as far as I could decode in the expenditure budget, there's no big push.
Yeah.
The Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, which is the flagship road building scheme, they allocated nearly 17,000 crore in the budget last year. They ended up spending only 15,000 crore. This year they've increased the amount to 16,000. How much they will actually end up spending? This is not a number that suggests there's a big push.
Correct.
Similarly, the Awas Yojana, right? You have a kind of contradiction, right? The government has repeatedly said that they want every Indian to have their own home by, I think 2022 is the target. But you have cut your allocation for the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. You allocated and spent last year 22,616 crore. This year you've allocated only 20,616 crore. So, it's unclear to me how this circle will be squared. Maybe they're thinking, as with health, that we'll have maybe loans, people take care of their own housing requirements. I don't know, but the allocations for the rural infrastructure, part of the rural economy, to my mind, seems a bit out of sync with this big push and focus on agriculture.
Correct, that's true. So, I mean, just before we move on to that, I just wanted to remind our viewers, please send in your questions and comments, and we'll be answering that. And we have a couple of questions, we put out a call. So, coming to health.
Actually, before we move on, there was a question that came in before we started this program. A viewer wanted to know the increase in MSP is a welcome step. Why most people are opposing it? What would be the situation before and after this step? I think we kind of addressed this somewhat. Broadly, the dispute would be where are you, what input costs are you taking on the basis of which you're going to give a 50% increase. That would be, probably an issue where farmers would continue to argue with the government.
Sure.
But I can't... I don't think anybody's opposing this idea. They're just saying this has come too late.
A little bit, a bit of a general angle that this is what was promised initially, and now they're saying that.
Correct, exactly.
But that's neither here or there. So one question on the health: is universal health insurance a substitute to government spending in creating public health infrastructure? So today, in the budget speech, he announced the National Health Protection Scheme as the world's largest government-funded healthcare insurance program.
It's unfortunate that despite the criticism that Mr. Jaitley received from anybody who understands, healthcare systems in the world, that a country like India, it's folly to try to build an insurance-driven, healthcare system. You have other developing countries that have achieved a much higher degree of success with either direct state-provided or hybrid systems. Here you have the undervaluing of public provision, the direct public provisioning of healthcare, and a big push to insurance. The only difference is the push last year was a little push. So under the Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, they had promised initially 30,000 rupees a year. Then they upped the figure to 1 lakh a year. Now Jaitley Sahab is talking of 5 lakhs a year. But essentially, this will be for hospitalization. This is an important point that viewers need to note, that somewhere from 70 to 75% of the expenditure by poor families on healthcare is medicines and outpatient, consultation fees and so on. Hospitalization accounts for perhaps 20% of your total expenditure, and it seems to me that this insurance scheme that the National Health what's the name they're giving it?
National Health Protection
Scheme will essentially be a kind of public-private partnership, to use a phrase that is popular among the private healthcare players.
Sure.
It wouldn't surprise me if private hospitals garner the lion's share of this insurance money.
Sure.
And I'm still putting a question mark about how serious the government is even on this scheme, because the Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana which is essentially what will get subsumed into the new health protection scheme. Last year, the allocation was 1,000 crore. They've doubled it to 2,000 crore. Now, viewers can do the maths here. You've increased your allocation or coverage from 30,000 to 1 lakh to 5 lakhs, but you're only doubling your allocation for the scheme. How Mr. Jaitley will square the circle, again, remains to be seen. I think that this is one of those announcements that is going to capture people's imagination, but once you start to read the details, or maybe people aren't even meant to read the details, this will emerge as a kind of a bait and switch.
Correct. And I mean, with most programs, even if you look at crop insurance, again, it's the same situation there, where it's underfunded. I think the Fiscal Bima Yojana has a 3,000 crore, but again,
that's right,
private companies, again, garner most of it. Claims are very low.
Exactly. Claims are low, and when claims are made, we ran a piece in The Wire from Rajasthan. There have been similar reports from Uttar Pradesh of farmers who actually suffered crop damage and who had paid premium and who were entitled to the full extent of protection that the Fasal Bima Yojana scheme promised them, but they were shortchanged or they were made to run around. And I think that this is, so the last mile delivery, let's not even go there, right? Maybe the government says, well, this is yet another reason to have Aadhaar. The Aadhaar will make sure. But, the fact is that these, which is why most serious public health experts question the need, question this emphasis on insurance-driven, provisioning. I think it's essential that the government beef up public health, primary healthcare centres. There is some talk in the budget of, I think the national, I forget the phrase he uses, but kind of health centres. There is, I'm not sure whether a serious amount of money is being put there, but the idea is to have 100 such centres where poor people could go and get their needs taken care of. Correct. But I think that this is not, to my mind, likely to be very effective.
I think the health ministry overall has 11.5% increase in its budget, which translates to around 5,000, 6,000 crores. So that's sort of what we're dealing with. Yeah. But
and the three questions have come in actually.
Okay, sure.
Related to health. Will the health insurance cover of 5 lakh rupees per family covering 50 crore people be enough to decimate the chances of the opposition forming the government? So that's a very, very political question. We said this is a political budget, but to my mind, as an analyst, as somebody who's looked at as a reporter, I don't think the forthcoming election will be fought and won on the pros and cons of the insurance scheme. Although I think it helps the Modi government's optics, because you've said Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. A major hole in this has been, the fact that people have to struggle to get basic health services. So this will be used by the government, but I think whether they can deliver enough by May 2019 for this to be a game changer, I have my doubts. No increase in the National Rural Health Mission budget. Is health insurance signalling an intent to privatize health? I think the reader's got it spot on.
Correct.
The focus is entirely on health insurance, and this is, of course, a form of privatization, because you are cutting back or not emphasizing the need for public expenditure and public provisioning, and which is why I saw some of the channels discussions. They had all these hospital executives and so on lauding Mr. Jaitley's announcement as a great revolutionary step. Well, it doesn't surprise me, because they will be the big beneficiaries of this.
Yeah. But just so, the middle class, so Mr. Modi's favorite constituency, is at least going by Twitter, is not happy. And even if you look at some of the things that, first of all, there's no change in personal income tax slabs. There has been a small deduction, we were just talking about it, basically as a 40,000 deduction on health and travel. It was earlier 15, a little bit more than that, you were saying, 35.
Yeah.
So a small increase in deduction, but no change in income tax slabs. And the story of the last 2 years in financial markets at least has been, mutual funds, the SIPs and whatnot, booming. And this time around, he's introduced a long-term capital gains tax of 10%, while keeping the securities transaction tax as well. And in the first year, I think he hopes to make something of 20,000 crores in revenue. So for the middle-class person, not too much.
Yeah. So you've raised the question, and in fact, the question that has been thrown at us most often on our Facebook page and on Twitter is, what's in the budget for the middle class? And related questions. And I think that you're right. This on the surface, on the face of it, there's plenty of reasons for the middle class to feel disappointed.
Yeah.
On the positive side, depending on, because conveyance and health exemptions were about 35,000 rupees a year. Mr. Jaitley has now made it 40. So there's a slight increase, and perhaps it's easier to file. So there's some benefit there, but he has upped the cess.
Yep.
The education cess, which was earlier 3%, is now
4.
a health and education cess, and it's going to be 4%. So what one hand gives, the other hand takes away. No revision in slabs. There's been some relief for middle class pensioners.
Correct.
So the amount of deduction that Mr. Jaitley will allow for interest earned on savings, on expenditure for hospitalization, and so on. He put a figure that this would amount to a give back of 4,000 crore. Right, so that's a major. If the number is robust,
correct,
that's a major gain for pensioners,
senior
citizens in this country.
Yeah.
People, we'll come to the LT CG, the capital gains, in a second, but number of tax. There was some focus on his in his budget speech on the fact that the number of tax returns has gone up, number of people filing has gone up, and he gave a figure, slight sleight of hand, because he compared the effective tax base at the start of fiscal year 2014-2015 with the end of fiscal year 16-17. So that's a 3-year figure, and it's a jump of about, I think, 2 crore, so from 6 to 8 crore.
Yeah.
It's quite a major jump, but unless we see the year-to-year increase, we can't attribute this figure the way Mr. Jaitley was implying to the great fight that the government waged against black money and hence notebandi and demonetization.
Correct.
So that's...
In fact, I mean, the survey had a good point on that as well. I think he ran some calculations and said just after demonetization, so 1.8 million new taxpayers. But then, he goes on to add in a caveat that most of these people fall within the 2.5 lakh exemption category. So there are a lot of people who are coming on board, but it's not leading to tax revenue for the government. It's,
exactly.
The advantages of this formalization are still yet to...
In fact, I posed a question after Mr. Modi's grand speech at the end of 2016, the 100-day, when he made his big speech and said, we've done this for, he pointed to the fact that the number of taxpayers is so low in the higher bracket, but the number of luxury cars sold is so much, the number of clubs membership is so much. And I said the true test of whether your demon policy will actually unearth black money and deal with people who aren't filing taxes is if you can show an increase, not in the overall tax base, right? Because dragging people in at the lower end who are below the exemption limit anyway, doesn't, so it's I think it's good to formalize things, but we want to know at the end of this process, this dissonance between the number of people whose reported income is say more than 10 lakhs a year, which is a teeny weeny amount, and the number of high-end cars sold, which is very high. Can you reduce that gap? So that's where I would like to see Mr. Jaitley come up with some numbers, and maybe it's early in the day.
Correct.
There is a question from a viewer on was it necessary to increase? Actually, we'll come to that in a second. Long-term capital gains, right? Which is the other middle class issue.
So it is. Sensex is down 300 points. And, the consensus seems to be it's not about the fiscal slippage so much. It's more about this issue because as he pointed out, the long capital gains income or revenue or so that's being generated by the industry is around 3 lakh crore.
This is a long-term capital gains, right?
Correct. So for the last year, and that's a pool that Jaitley wants to tap into, and that's what he's.
The question that somebody's asking is, what will be the impact of long-term capital gains tax on investments in mutual funds and life insurance? Mr. Jaitley kept emphasizing that he was trying to level the playing field here, right, between different kinds of saving schemes and so on. I thought, quite frankly, that this was a good move. In the sense that I think long-term capital gains, we had the Oxfam report the other day, right? The Credit Suisse report, which talks of a huge imbalance in wealth ownership in this country. Huge imbalance even in terms of the latest amount of wealth being generated. And clearly this is a product of long-term capital gains. I mean, there's short-term gains too, which is taxed, but there is a lot of long-term gains happening. There is inheritance. Yeah. And I would have liked to see, in addition to long-term capital gains, an inheritance tax of some kind. We have questions on that, but you know, and yes, in my view, it would be an unambiguously good thing. But Mr. Jaitley clearly, you know, doesn't. You know, I don't understand. There's no political risk either, right? Because the majority of Indians will not be inconvenienced by an inheritance tax. And you know, every advanced capitalist country, the United Kingdom, Germany, the US. You know, has a robust inheritance tax, and I think, you know, it's
very
time.
Steep one as well.
Exactly. I mean, steep is punitive in some ways. So this encourages philanthropy. This encourages a rational use of some of these assets, and it ensures that undeserving scions don't get hold of all this wealth that they haven't done any work for.
But I think the counter argument, at least what the market is saying for long-term capital gains tax, is that the survey also, for instance, it applauded this formalization of financialization of savings. That, you know, we're not hiding it underneath our beds, we're not investing it in gold where it's unproductive. We're putting it to the market, and that's helping India Inc. Per se. And there's a small fear that now that people will start pulling out. And,
I don't know. I wonder if, you know, because 10% is not a very high. It's not punitive. He was careful to grandfather. So mom and pop savers, people like you and I who have, you know, some, you know, piddling amounts of money in stocks and shares that you've held for a while. Whatever long-term gains you have locked in as of Jan 31st, right? People are asked. There's a question on the mechanics of how this would work. From what I understood from his speech, and I must say I haven't further delved into the provisions of the finance bill, but essentially any long-term capital gains you've made as of Jan 31st, whether or not you've cashed them out or not, would continue to remain exempt, right? And it's after that. So I think, you know, under the circumstances, it's a soft landing for such a tax, right? Things could have been much worse.
Correct.
But I think that this is something new, and it doesn't surprise me that the markets are upset about this. And investors...
But they knew. I mean, so I think the most recent hint was from the Prime Minister himself, who the last week of December came out and said, you know, we need this. That's true. But another reason, so Siddharth, we've gotten a couple of questions of people asking the prices of certain commodities like cigarettes, have they increased or not? So the majority of indirect taxes, as we call taxes on these kind of products, are now been subsumed under the goods and services tax regime. So things like cigarettes, you know, which used to be, I think Chidambaram used to call it, I can't remember, he had a word for it, but, you know, basically increasing here, decreasing there a little bit in order to please certain things. So that practice is more or less ended with the introduction of the goods and GST regime as a whole. And for instance, that could be a reason why, you know, the middle class is also upset. So, you know, earlier if they didn't have income tax slab changes, at least you would make eating out cheaper or buying expensive cars cheaper. And but
I noticed on the excise front there is some up and down that's happened.
There's bizarrely, I mean, so the customs duty on mobile phones has been increased.
Correct. And raw cashew nuts has come down.
Correct. I mean, to a certain extent, this is for Make in India. He wants to do this, but another extent, that's another blow from the middle class. People buy. You know, Chinese phones are now 60%, 70% of the Indian market. So it's going to hurt them from that perspective.
Yes. I mean, in the sense that, I mean, on the indirect front, the GST blow and the kind of uneven manner in which it's being implemented, and I suspect a lot of shops are also, you know, really gouging customers. So if you have some of these increases in customs duty, that's going to have a further negative effect on middle class consumers. Correct. No doubt about it. Yeah,
that's true. But for small and medium businesses, it's been a good. We have at least 2-3 questions on how is the BJP planning to create 70 lakhs jobs when it's not been able to create that much in previous 3 years. So I think the MSME sector has been treated well this time around. So the tax regime, Jaitley's promised 4 years ago that it would come down to 25%, and he's still not achieved that. He has one more year, but I doubt it'll happen next year. But at least the turnover threshold, it used to be 50 crores last year, but now companies that have 250 crores, there's been a reduction in their...
my sense is that this is all being driven by a four-letter word, jobs. Mr. Modi's hopes of coming within sniffing distance, I think even that's not possible, but coming, some way towards fulfilling the promises he made to the young people of India in 2014 rests on the MSMEs and self-employed, his famous comment on pakoda sales. There was actually a little joke. I don't think he meant it as a joke, but Mr. Jaitley ended his budget speech with this lengthy quote from Vivekananda about a new India, and there was a reference to the fritter seller, which is basically pakoda wala, right? So, clearly the hopes of creating this, 10 million jobs a year rests on the MSMEs. We know from data that large corporations are not hiring, notwithstanding the still unresolved puzzle of EPFO.
Correct.
The fact that you have an increase in the number of payroll, sort of enlistees in the, Provident Fund organization. But the fact is that it's the small and medium guys who are going to have to put their shoulder to the wheel and increase the number of jobs. Can that happen in a sufficient number between now and March 2019, which is when effectively voting will start, right? Correct. Because the process has to end by May. It's clear that it cannot happen, right? So, I think creating a sense that creating the impression that we're trying to do something is what Mr. Modi probably has in mind.
There was another interesting thing that was thrown in there. So the government is now going to pay 12% of the EPF contribution and then 8% for women, I believe. I'm not completely sure on the mechanics of it, how it's going to work in terms of reimbursement or how it will be paid.
I wasn't clear about the mechanics of this. We'll have to look into the fine print because, I should also tell our viewers that over the next 2 or 3 days, we will have actually a complete set of analytical pieces that will explain to you in detail the impact of this budget for different sectors, impact of this budget for you, for your own pocketbook in terms of if you're an employee, what it means for taxes, what it means for Provident Fund, what it means for pensions, so on and so forth. So just keep tuning in to the Wire for the next couple of days to learn in more detail about some of these provisions. We got a couple of questions from people which are kind of the populist variety. Somebody says, was it necessary to increase the salary of the president and governors and vice president? And I think yes, I think it is necessary because these salaries haven't been revised since 2006. We're not talking of huge sums of money in any case, right? And Jaitley was smart enough, and I don't understand why finance ministers did not do this in the past, to index link the pay of members of parliament. I think that we can do away with pay commissions and so on, even for government employees, if you have a rational indexation, so that you don't need to go through this mammoth exercise and suddenly boost everybody's pay. But I think that this is part of, there is resentment. Oh, these guys, president, governor, who are they? Why should they get paid so much? But we're not talking of huge amounts of pay here, first of all. And I think in the scheme of things, I don't have a problem with it.
RP should be paid more.
Exactly.
There's still some uncertainty over the fiscal math in general, and we will probably have a couple of pieces later this year. So, he noted that GST revenue has only been counted for 11 months instead of the whole year. He talked about deferment of spectrum auction. So,
ambitious disinvestment targets.
Yes, so 80,000. But it's not so ambitious if you taking from the right pocket and putting it to the left, which is...
the ONGC, IOL,
HPCL.
To my mind is completely ridiculous. It's a clear case of just jugaad, trying to get money any which way. But I think the big ticket, maybe they will move on Air India. There was some talk of even clubbing insurance companies together.
Yes.
So I think creative or imaginative schemes of harvesting or harnessing public sector cash balances and deploying them for the fisc, that may help you improve your numbers. I'm not sure whether this is the wisest thing that you should be doing in terms of long-term fiscal rectitude.
Correct. I think they recognize it as well. So this year target was 70, they hit 1 lakh crore, and so the next year is not, it's just 80,000 crore. So we'll have to...
There's one question which has come in. What is the exact amount of tax expenditure or revenue foregone this year? It's a good question. I should point out that I think effectively last budget, the government, the finance ministry took a call. Earlier they would give a figure for revenue foregone, right? So what revenue foregone means is essentially the government has a tariff card, a tax scheme, for example, a tax rate, and then it exempts various industries from those taxes on one grounds or the other, and the budget documents would add up the value of those exemptions and present them as a figure of revenue foregone. This, of course, became a huge propaganda point for critics of the government of the day, saying, "Oh, you're taxing the poor people so much. You're not spending enough money on schools and hospitals, and you're letting the fat cats off." That was perhaps not entirely a fair way of looking at revenue foregone, but there was an element of, letting people who can afford to pay tax off the hook.
Yeah.
Those figures are no longer being given.
Correct.
So we cannot easily. There's perhaps a way to calculate.
Sure. Yeah, and they've given some. So, for instance, the reduction in corporate tax, they said it would be like, I think, a 7,000 crore hit,
right,
and so on and so forth. But yeah, we could. We can actually get back to you on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll try to. Yeah. Our former colleague P. Sainath would actually write a piece breaking down the revenue foregone year after year. We'll see if we can do that kind of exercise, even if the government isn't giving it. There is also a question on job creation. We've answered. Skills, I don't see anything major in terms of.
I think the bump up is very marginal,
and the way these schemes have been functioning in any case
is just. I mean, we've written a lot about.
We carried this marvelous piece by Dr. Orlando Ruthven, who actually on the Wire last year. I urge people to go look for that, which actually was a microeconomic look at the way in which skill development translates or does not translate into jobs for those who acquire these skills. The fact is that company after company, they are not interested in hiring permanent, full-time employees in good quality jobs. Right? So they want to have people turning over. They don't want to formalize those. So I don't know if, as a consequence of demonetization, the incentive to formalize jobs is going to go up. No. I somehow doubt it. But I don't see. Until that changes, I don't see the skills initiative.
I mean, the flagship programs themselves, even by the ministry's own audit, shows that it's failing miserably in this thing. And of course, the solution there also is other.
Should we end on big picture? So I mean, how do you see this budget in terms of the overall economy? Yeah, let's end on that note.
So I think clearly he's not a fiscal hawk. He's been very pragmatic in that sense. And in fact, I think we had another question on what are the differences between the UPA and NDA government. And then it's not too much. Of course, in terms of subsidies, it's slowly come down. But in part, he's been helped by the fall in global oil prices and so on and so forth. So I think a very pragmatic budget, I would say.
Yeah, Keynes used to say in the long run we're all dead. I would say in the long run, we're all Keynesians. Whether you're NDA or the UPA, at the end of the day, when faced with the reality of an election here, rural distress, lack of growth, lack of jobs, governments have no option but to dig deep and find ways to spend. I would say that the fiscal deficit, the composition of it could have been better. I think. Rather than thinking of money for insurance schemes, it would have been good to have a big push. In fact, when I first, this idea of 5 lakhs times, 10 crore people, that's a huge amount of money. And I thought, okay, are they going to actually spend this on physical, hospital infrastructure? That would be great.
It's just potential coverage.
Exactly. So it's potential insurance coverage. So I think that, once you peel back the numbers, you see that actually, whether they will have the desired Keynesian effect also remains to be seen. And so, so the big picture, to my mind, this is in some ways a budget induced by political panic, maybe too strong a word, but I think the political recognition that this is now 11 months, 12 months till when the election campaigning starts in earnest, and Mr. Modi will be judged on the extent to which he's delivered on his promises. Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas has to mean something beyond a slogan. 10 million jobs a year, people are going to want accounting for that. And this is his last attempt. And the justice for the rural economy and for farmers.
Correct.
This is his last attempt to deliver on those.
So, thanks for joining us. And please do keep an eye out for the rest of our coverage and analysis later today and tomorrow.